Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there as you join me for this journey? This evening, we step into one of the greatest stories ever told. The tale of Aeneas, the Trojan exile who carried the ashes of Troy across the seas to plant the seed of Rome. It is a story of fire and loss, of gods and destiny, of love and sorrow, and of the empire that would one day rule the world. So find a comfortable place, let the noise of the day slip away, and allow this legendary journey to carry you across time. I speak from the ash of Troy, from embers that still glow behind my eyes. My name is Aeneas, son of Anchises, and the goddess of dawn's clear air. And I have carried a city's last breath across the sea. If you will sit with me a while, I will unspool the night our walls folded like a paper lantern, and the gods turned their faces, and all we could do was hold one another and walk through fire toward the faintest promise of tomorrow. We had grown used to mourning. 10 years of siege had taught us the color of loss, how it stains a doorway, how it sleeps in a child's hair. When the Greeks vanished, leaving only a vast wooden horse on the sand and a harbor of empty masts, our city inhaled too quickly. Joy rushed in like wind. Priam's sons laughed again. The streets remembered music. But my mother, the veiled one who comes to me in dreams, brushed my face like a cold breeze and left me uneasy. A gift left by an enemy is an argument that refuses to end. A silence after long shouting is a silence that listens. By dusk the horse had been dragged inside, its wheels shrieking against stones polished by years of sandals and prayer. We set wine before the gods. We hung garlands from the lintels. Dancers spun like sparks in the courtyards. And an old soldier touched the horse's flank and asked, half joking, whether it was listening. When the night deepened and the torches thinned, when the moon tilted like a white shield over the ridge of Ida, I slept in my father's house and dreamed of a river not yet named, of a stone that would one day be kissed smooth by laws and footsteps. I woke to a sound that is never only a sound. Bronze on bronze, the shriek of hinges, the bellow of men who have trained themselves to be merciless. The city was not a city, but a waking wound. From the horse's belly they poured like blackened wheat, and the gates were open to the fleets sliding back along the current of night. Flames went up as if every house had been waiting its whole life to burn. I strapped on armor that had not known victory in years. My heart hammered, not from courage, but because my son slept down the hall and my father's breath was thin and stubborn. I kissed Creusa's hair and told her to ready the household gods. Then I stepped into streets that had become rivers of firelight and shadow. We met under a fig tree by the ruined altar of Pan. Coroebus, bold even then. Androgeos, who mistook us for Greeks and died surprised. A scatter of men whose names deserve more than the ash that swallowed them. We fought like memory fights, wildly with all the precision of desperation. For a street, for a doorway, for a flight of stairs we won. And then the tide returned with spear tips for foam. We reached Priam's palace and found the very center of memory turned to a furnace. Neoptolemus, born of the great killer, drove like a nail through doors that had admitted kings, and at the steps where justice once balanced, old Priam fell. I will not dress this for tenderness. Hecuba wailed from the altar like a wind broken against rock. I saw the city die in a single moment and learned that grief can be a clear bell. It rang me toward my own house. On the way, a god spoke, not with thunder, but with the intimate pressure of a hand on the shoulder. I turned and saw the air rippling, and through it the faces of those who shape wars as shepherds shape flocks. "It is not the Greeks," said the breath in my ear, "who unhouse you. We have decided the map must change. Take what can be carried, your father, your son, your household gods, and the grain of courage that remains. The rest belongs to the morning I ran." Flames leaned down from roofs as if to look at us. The smoke tasted of cedar and barley and old prayers. My father refused me. "I will not leave," he said. "I have lived my years. Let me fall with the house," I begged him. I told him what the god had said. He set his jaw like stone. It was my son who saved us. A pale fire played on his curled hair. On his small forehead, an omen shone like a coin in sunlight. In that trembling light, my father's hard resolve broke, and he bowed his head to destiny. I lifted him to my back and felt his age settle over my shoulders like a history I could not drop. Ascanius clung to my tunic. Creusa gathered what could be called a home. Little statues warm from the altar, a scarf that still smelled of lavender, the keys to doors that no longer existed. We chose the lanes where the earth remembered our feet. Neighbors called from doorways. A cart's axle snapped with a crack that sounded like a prophecy. A dog ran by with a child's ribbon in its mouth. Before us, a beam fell in a white burst, and after, the night yawned into a courtyard we had never noticed, as though the city had kept a hidden path just for our leaving. I did not look back. There are times when the eye drags the heart into ruins it cannot escape. At the foot of the hill where the cypresses climb, we were to gather. The place was crowded with faces turned into masks by smoke and fear. Some carried bundles that were nothing more than a habit of hope. Empty boxes, wrapped pots with nothing inside, a cage that had held a dove long flown. I set my father down and counted breath instead of time. Then I counted the people I loved and found the number wrong. Creusa was not there. I went back against the current of bodies, calling her name the way a man calls to the one lamp left in a storm. Doorways opened on rooms bitten clean by fire. The street I thought I knew forked like a tongue and led me past walls that leaned, listening. I saw my home again. A black rind of wood, a courtyard full of sparks like souls too light to rise. In that place where we had kept bread and lullabies, I found only noise and the idiot joy of flame. I ran on, toward the temple where we had promised to meet if we were torn apart, toward the corner where a fig tree made a square of gentler dark. The temple was a mouth of smoke. The fig tree trembled with heat. Only my echo answered me. When I could not find her by walking, I sought her by prayer. I asked every god who had ever visited my mother's bed, every god who had ever accepted oil or wine from my hand. I said I would accept any future if they would only return the present. In a narrow lane washed with smoke, where the stones sweated and the air rang like metal, a shape gathered from the heat as if my longing had sculpted it. Creusa's voice came before her face, soft, because she had always been the gentle one. "Love," she said, and my name was in the word. "Do not punish yourself with impossible turns. My road is not your road," her outline held, pale as milk, while the houses flexed and the sky threw sparks. "Our sun will be led by stars you cannot yet read. You must obey them. Carry the gods, find the coast, build the days. In a new land, A river will learn your step, and a people will borrow your breath to speak their first laws. I reached to touch her and felt the cruelty of gifts that cannot be held. She smiled the way dawn sometimes does, with tears. "Remember me," she said, "as the city I was. Do not turn salt. Be the road I could not keep her." The air drank her back, and I was left with the echo a shell keeps of the sea. I stumbled to the hill where the others waited, with ash under my nails and a voice that did not sound like mine. We did not argue with morning. When the east began to bloom with that indifferent blue that always follows ruin, we took what we had saved and set out for the shore. Behind us, gulls circled the smoke as if counting. Ahead, the surf stitched and unstitched the same white seam, patient as fate. I lifted my father once more. Aeneas walked at my side with a seriousness that belongs to small kings. Around us, the refugees of Troy moved like the scattered bones of a single body trying to remember its shape. The ships we found were not the proud-bellied ones that carry triumph in their shade. They were patched and earnest, nets mended into sails, planks that had returned from other lives. We loaded the gods, and when I set them by the prow, they seemed to breathe easier, as if even divinity rests better when the earth no longer remembers where you live. The sea opened. We left the line of the coast the way you leave a sentence you have said too often. The oars bit and released, like teeth learning patience. On the first night at sea, when the stars had drawn their familiar nets and the water turned to a moving mirror, I dreamed again. My mother stood on a strand of sand that could have been any shore, and in her hand was a sprig of silver-leaved hope. "You have done what you must," she told me. "Now you will do what is asked." Behind her, I sensed a city sketching itself from fog. A forum, an arch, a flame that never goes out. I did not know its name. I did not need to. The heart knows when it is walking toward a word it will one day speak as home. When I woke, the dark was thinner. Men slept with their mouths open, as if trying to swallow the dawn. My father murmured to the Lares like a man speaking to old friends, and my son traced constellations on the deck with a wet finger. I looked back once, to the smoke that had been our world, and then I turned to the blank page of the sea. Troy was finished. We were not. I held the tiller and felt the long hand of destiny settle over mine, not heavy, not cruel, simply firm, like a teacher correcting a child's grip. So hear me, you who listen by lamplight or phone glow. You who lean your head against a window and want the road to name you. The night our city fell, we learned what to carry and how to walk without looking behind. This is how our story begins. On water, with ash still on our tongues, and a promise like a star we cannot stop seeing. I am Aeneas, and I am not done. When dawn began to rise from the back of the sea, we rowed toward a horizon that had no kindness in it. The waves breathed with a steady patience, as though they had seen countless cities burn and countless peoples try again. Behind us, Troy was only a bruise of smoke. Before us stretched a blue so wide it might have been the silence of the gods themselves. We had no map, only omens and the rhythm of loss. Anchises sat near the prow, his aged eyes sharper than mine when it came to signs. He read the curve of birds, the sudden change of wind, the way salt tasted on the tongue. Each night he unrolled the stars and searched for instruction, and each morning he told us which direction fate might be waiting. My son Aeneas clung to my side, too young for war, too young for exile, and yet already carrying both. Sometimes I caught him staring at the horizon, as if he could see through it to the land promised in whispers. We touched many coasts. On Thracian shores we tried to build walls, hopeful that foreign soil might take the seed of our grief. Yet the ground itself rejected us. When I pulled roots from the earth and to plant a sacrifice, blood welled up instead of water. A voice rose from beneath the soil, the murdered ghost of Polydorus, Priam's son, who had been betrayed and pierced by the very land we trusted. Horror sealed our decision. We tore down what little we had built and fled, carrying the memory of his cries like salt on our tongues. Next, we sought the sacred island of Delos, the birthplace of Apollo, hoping the god of prophecy would bend his voice toward us. The priests welcomed us with garlands, and the oracle's words trembled in the chamber like wind trapped in stone. Seek your ancient mother. There a house will rise and a dynasty will reign. My father heard ancient mother and thought of Crete, where our ancestor Teucer once lived. So we sailed there with hope, believing the riddle solved. On Crete we built again. We raised an altar. We plowed the soil with borrowed strength. But before our foundations could settle, sickness spread like a shadow. Crops withered. Bodies grew hot and thin. Anchises dreamed, and in his sleep the household gods appeared, their little wooden faces stern with warning. Not here, they said. The motherland is further still. You must seek Hesperia, a land washed by the western sea. Their destiny waits. When he woke, his voice was steady. Italy. That is the name the gods whispered, so once again we tore down what we had barely built and trusted our lives to the heaving back of the sea. The journey was not kind. Storms rose like armies, each wave a spear, each gust a cry. Often we thought Neptune himself wished to crush us for daring to carry futures across his domain. We lost comrades to the deep, their names now carried only in my chest. Yet whenever despair threatened, a sign would come. A dolphin leaping silver from foam. A sudden clearing in the stars, the faint outline of land, when we thought the horizon endless. We touched Epirus and found a bitter reflection. Helenus, son of Priam, had built a small Troy there, complete with walls and gates that mimicked our lost city. He and his wife Andromache, once the faithful bride of Hector, welcomed us with tears and feasts. Their kindness was a mirror in which we saw both comfort and grief. They, too, had been torn from fire and had tried to stitch memory into stone. Helenus, a prophet, read the omens for us. He warned of Scylla and Charybdis, the twin jaws of the sea that devoured even the bravest sailors. He urged us to seek the shores of Italy, but to beware the cunning of Greeks and the wrath of Juno, queen of the heavens, who hated us for being the seed of Troy. With heavy gifts and heavier farewells, we departed, hearts torn between gratitude and sorrow. As we sailed past Sicily's coast, the warnings proved true. We saw the cave of the Cyclops, its mouth black as a wound. Polyphemus, the giant blinded by cunning Odysseus, stumbled along the shore. His hollow socket turned toward us, his cries like thunder dragged across rock. We pulled at the oars with terror as our guide, Achaemenides, a Greek we had rescued, abandoned by his comrades, begged us to flee. We escaped, but not without feeling the hot breath of fate upon our necks. And then came the storm that scattered us. Juno, never satisfied with vengeance, summoned winds from Iola's prison. They struck our fleet with fists of water and coils of gale. Ships vanished into troughs so deep they seemed swallowed by the earth. I clung to the tiller and prayed, not for victory, only for dawn. Neptune rose from the deep, angered not at us, but at Juno for trespassing in his realm. With a single glance, the waves settled, ashamed before their master. Yet the damage was done. 7 ships remained, their crews hollow-eyed, their sails in tatters. We drifted, exhausted, to the coast of Libya. There the cliffs of Carthage rose, new-built and humming with ambition. We did not know then how fateful that harbor would be. For in its queen, Dido, I would find both shelter and a wound that never closed. But that tale belongs to another dawn. That night, as my men slept on the sand and I kept watch, the gods came again, not in dream, but in the clear silence between waves. My mother Venus shone above the surf, her face calm as moonlight. "You suffer," she said, "because destiny is sharp. But do not doubt, the land waits. Italy stretches her arms. From you will come kings, and from those kings, empires. Hold steady, my son. The sea is cruel, but the story is kinder." I bowed to her light, though my heart carried both gratitude and grief. For every step toward fate seemed a step away from the ashes where Creusa's voice still lingered. Yet what choice has a man marked by gods but to walk forward? So we gathered again the next morning, broken yet breathing, and turned our faces once more toward the horizon. The sea lifted us, set us down, lifted us again as though rehearsing the long rhythm of exile. And I, Aeneas, felt both smaller than a wave and larger than a promise. For in my arms I held not just a son or a father, but the fragile future of a people who refused to end. When our weary oars carved the last mile to safety, the cliffs of Africa rose like a curtain pulled back by the gods. Carthage stood young yet proud, its walls still wet with mortar, its streets humming with the music of beginnings. We, who had lost everything, looked upon those walls as beggars gaze upon bread. The men, starved and salt-worn, fell to the sand and kissed it as though it were the bosom of a mother. I offered thanks to the gods with a heart both grateful and wary. For often the sweetest fruit hides a bitter pit, and Juno, ever watchful, ever wrathful, had sown snares for us even here. Still, we ventured inland. Columns rose white against the sun. The harbor bustled with ships that came bearing cedar, ivory, and purple dye, the lifeblood of a city rising to empire. I marveled at the order. Streets laid true, theaters echoing with song, temples where priests lifted smoke toward the sky. It seemed to me a second Troy might be waking before my eyes. Only stronger, for it was untouched by war. It was then that I first beheld her, Dido, Queen of Carthage. She stood among her people like a flame among shadows. Tall, robed in Tyrian crimson, a circlet of gold catching the light. Her eyes were not soft, but clear and commanding, the eyes of one who had carved a kingdom from exile. Yet when they fell upon us, strangers, storm-tossed, hollow with loss, they softened with something like kinship. She welcomed us as though fate had written our names in her heart. "You are not enemies," she said, her voice carrying both honey and iron. "You are brothers in suffering. For I too was torn from my home. I know the taste of exile. My city will shelter yours, and my hearth will warm your gods." Her kindness struck me deeper than any spear. For years we had known only suspicion, the edge of swords, the cold of indifference. To be offered safety without barter felt a miracle. My men feasted in her halls, where lamps glowed like amber and the air smelled of cedar and myrrh. They drank wine that stained their lips with joy, and for a night the ash of Troy seemed far behind us. Yet the gods are never idle. Venus, my mother, feared Juno's schemes and sought to protect me. She sent her son, Cupid, disguised as Aeneas, to breathe into Dido's heart a fire she could not quench. Thus love, that most delicate of chains, was laid upon her. Day by day she grew nearer. She walked beside me through her rising city, showing me the half-built towers, the markets rich with trade, the temples where her people prayed. At night, when torches painted the walls with gold, she would bid me tell again the story of Troy. And I, though each word tore open wounds still bleeding, spoke. I told her of Hector's last stand, of Priam's fall, of Creus's ghost fading into smoke. I told her of storms and omens, of the road that had brought us here. She listened as though each syllable were a jewel, her eyes filling with both tears and fire. In her gaze I saw not only pity, but something more dangerous. Desire, twined with destiny. And in my own heart, I felt the ache of her beauty, the solace of her strength. Could I not at last end my wandering here? Could we not build Troy anew in these walls, under this queen's sheltering hand? The gods answered with silence, and silence is often the harshest voice. One day the hunt was planned. Dido rode beside me, her cloak streaming like fire, her spear glinting. The forest echoed with horns, with the baying of hounds, with the thunder of hooves. But the heavens watched, and Juno conspired with Venus, twining their powers in a cruel accord. As clouds gathered, the hunt broke in storm. Rain lashed the trees, and thunder split the sky. Dido and I sought shelter in a cavern, our followers scattered by the storm's rage. There, in the hollow of earth and flame, fate bound us. The storm outside became the chorus of our joining. Dido's voice trembled with passion, mine with need. We were no longer queen and exile, but man and woman, fire and fuel. The cavern walls bore witness as though they were altars, and in her embrace I forgot the weight of prophecy. She called it marriage, I called it mercy. Yet in truth it was neither. It was the gods weaving rope around our throats. For soon Mercury, messenger of Jupiter, descended swift as light, his voice sharper than lightning's edge. He found me in the calm after passion and spoke with the authority of heaven. Aeneas, are you here to build glory for yourself, or to found the empire destined for your son? Do you not see that Italy waits, that Rome will one day rise from your blood? Carthage is not your home. This queen is not your fate. If you linger, you betray both your gods and your line. Leave, and leave at once. The words struck like iron into my chest. My veins ran cold. For though love whispered one thing, destiny thundered another. I knew then that to stay would be to betray more than prophecy. It would be to betray Creus's last plea, my father's trust, my son's future. Yet how could I tell Dido? How could I rip away the hope she had wrapped around us both? I delayed, I hesitated, but destiny does not pause. At last I gave the order. The ships were to be made ready in secret. The men, though reluctant, obeyed. But nothing hides from a woman whose heart is ablaze. Dido knew. She confronted me, her eyes twin storms, her voice torn between love and fury. Did I not give you shelter? Did I not share my throne, my soul, my very bed? And you would abandon me like driftwood? Is this the honor of Troy's sons? I stood before her, words choking in my throat. I wanted to say that I loved her. I wanted to say that if fate were mine to command, I would have stayed. But what voice can defy Jupiter's decree? I owe you gratitude beyond measure, I told her, but my destiny lies in Italy. It is not my will, but the will of the gods. If I could choose, I would remain. But I am commanded. Forgive me. There is no forgiveness for such wounds. She turned from me, her shoulders trembling, her silence heavier than curses. I left her halls like a thief, though I carried nothing but sorrow. By dawn the sails were hoisted, the oars set to rhythm. Carthage's coast receded, its towers black against the rising sun. From the deck I saw fire leap skyward, Dido's pyre, though I did not yet know it. She had chosen death over abandonment, and her last breath was a curse upon me and all my descendants. Let there be hatred between our peoples, she cried into the flame. Let my blood and his seed never reconcile. Let war haunt them for all their days, her cry traveled further than any wind. It became a seed buried deep in history, one that would blossom centuries later in wars between Rome and Carthage. But on that morning, all I felt was grief. My men rode in silence. My son pressed his small hand to mine, and my father whispered prayers I could not hear. The sea opened again, wide and pitiless. Carthage faded behind us, a wound we would carry forever. Ahead lay Italy, and with it the empire that demanded every sacrifice. I stood at the prow, the salt stinging my eyes, and swore that I would obey, even if obedience meant leaving love in ashes. The sea kept our secrets as we fled Carthage. For days the wind moved like a slow thought, and the oars clicked to the water's bones. At night, when the men slept dreamless from exhaustion, I lay awake with Dido's fire behind my eyes. Grief is a tide. It pulls you backward even as you row forward. Yet fate is a harder current. It carried us, willing or not, toward the coast that had haunted our maps of hope. Sicily rose first, a familiar shoulder lifting from the blue. There my father had died, Drepanum's cliffs still watching like old judges. And there I ordered funeral games, because a people who have lost their city must rehearse being a people. We cleared a race course on the beach and drew a ring in the sand for contests. Oarsmen churned the bay until each prow bit and released like eager teeth. I gave a Tyrian purple cloak to the victors, a vine-engraved cup to the bold, and for a brief hour cheering did not feel like blasphemy. Entellus, hoary and iron, stood against lithe dares. The old lion woke and the young one fell, and the crowd remembered what deference is owed to time. Archers split feathers from the air, wrestlers ground sand in their teeth and smiled. Boys raced with the raw joy of still believing the world will widen for them. But Juno's malice does not tire. While we contended for honor, a whisper moved through the quietest tent. Our women, worn thin by salt and miles, looked at the ships and saw not salvation, but a sentence. A goddess lent their grief a voice. Here is earth. Here are graves. Why keep wandering? Torches leapt from hand to hand. Flame climbed the rigging as if the hulls themselves begged to rest. I ran with water and prayer. Smoke combed my lungs. Then Jupiter's pity broke the sky. Rain hammered the decks, hissed along the ropes, turned rage to steam. When the fire died and the counting began, some ships were scars and some were ashes. With Acestes, I left a few families there, a good earth for the spent and the old, to seed a city that would carry a faint, faithful echo of Troy. The rest of us turned again to the sea. At Cumae, the land smelled of laurel and sulfur, the breath of gods who dream beneath the earth. Apollo's grove held a cave whose mouth is the world's when it needs to speak in riddles. I brought offerings and steadied my hands. I come for a door, I told the priestess, whose pupils seemed to hold lightning. Let me descend where shadows keep their names. I seek my father. All wish to go down, the Sibyl said. Few can return. Leaves shivered as if they were little bells. Bring me the golden bough, mistletoe that shines like a captive sun. It yields only to the fated hand. Among trees that leaned as though listening, I found it. A spray that gleamed when my fingers reached, as if fate itself recognized its debtor. With that light and gifts for the dead, I followed her into the earth. The underworld begins not with darkness, but with a thinning of sound. The air holds its breath. We passed the infant's meadow, where beginnings that had been unbegun stared with wide, unfinished eyes. We crossed the place where Minos weighs stories and gives them their final titles. We skirted fields where those undone by love drift like moths around a burning tune. There, Dido stood. Her gaze pierced me more cleanly than any spear. Her silence refused my pleas. I told her the truth, that I had not left for pleasure, that a god's errand is a chain you cannot break without breaking your soul. She turned away toward her first husband, Sychaeus, and the light made a hard coin of her profile. Grief taught me again to walk without demanding forgiveness. Beyond the screaming fields of war and the iron cities of punishment, the air widened. The Sibyl bathed the bough, the gatekeepers nodded us through. In Elysium the grasses sang, and the light did not glare, but welcomed. There my father stood, not bent, not breath scarce, but tall as mornings I remembered. He held me, and everything I had carried fell silent in that embrace. Come, Anchises said. As if distance were another son he welcomed home. He led me to a river where spirits wait to be poured into mortal clay. They moved like sparks over water, the unborn future of a nation not yet named. He showed me a pageant no man could look upon without burning. Kings who would be law as well as sword. A small farmer who would turn a ridge of hills into a city crowned with eagles. Brothers whose quarrel would draw a wall across a river. A boy of bright doom whom all would love and lose, and one whose settled peace would clasp the world so gently, even war would close its eyes. From you, my father said, will come a people who bind strength with mercy. Remember this when the day darkens. I did not pretend to deserve such futures. Anchises read my doubt, the way a helmsman feels the wind shift. Seek allies not only strong but just, he said. Trust the river that will meet you like an old friend. Where a white sow lies beneath oaks nursing 30 young, there mark your first home. Do not envy Turnus his speed, nor disdain Evander's poverty. Honor the dead. Teach your son to rule himself. We embraced once more. His chest the shape of home, his beard the old familiar rasp. And a winnow leaf felt pressed us back toward life. The bough grew heavy in my hand. The cavern's cold returned. But I carried a steadier fire than when I entered. Italy at last. The coast gleamed like a promise that had learned patience. The Tiber came to meet us with green arms open, backing itself gently into the sea as though bowing us ashore. We kissed the mud that would one day be marble. Under a great oak, a white sow slept, her 30 young arrayed like a soft calendar. We laughed, the laughter of men who have finally found a sign that keeps its word. I sent envoys to King Latinus, ruler of Latium, a man who measured desire against omens. His daughter Lavinia stood beside the altar like a dawn the city had not yet earned. Once, flames played in her hair and left no harm. An image that promised a blaze of fortune and caught the hawk eye of Turnus, the Rutulian prince who called her his. Latinus listened as we asked not for stolen fields, but for room to breathe and room to sow. He looked past my armor to the road behind me and, weighing fate with care, offered peace, a share of land, and, if omens would have it, his daughter's hand. For a moment I felt the earth steady under my feet. Juno shook it down. From the rot at history's bottom she summoned Alecto, a fury who hoards grudges like coin. Alecto breathed on small resentments until they were furnaces. A tether snapped. A stag, wounded by a careless arrow, stumbled bleeding into a courtyard. Cries rose that were larger than their cause. Mothers dreamed their boys pierced by foreign spears. Turnus woke already shouting. The countryside ripened for war as fast as summer ripens figs. I armed not because I hungered to, but because I owed the living. We raised a palisade near the Tiber and set a shrine where the little household gods could rest their solemn faces and catch our breath with us. I looked at Ascanius and saw the long road trying to settle on his narrow shoulders. To keep it from crushing him, I needed friends. So I followed the river upstream, its olive water murmuring counsel against my hull, until it bore me to Palanteum, a hill town worn but noble where King Evander kept poverty like a virtue. He welcomed me with a grip that measured men fairly. On his hearth I met his son, Pallas. Bright as a coin newly struck, I felt as fathers do, how swiftly affection can become a promise. That night, under garlands for Hercules, Evander spoke of an old monster strangled near those very stones, and of the future the hills were saving. A city that would one day become law given shape. Help us against Turnus, he said, and take our friendship as the first brick. I swore it. The oaks seemed to agree. From there, I sought the Etruscans, people disciplined by water and wind. Their leader, Trojan, bound himself to our cause when prophecy released his hands from a wicked king and allowed him to choose a just war. Oars stitched treaties across the river. The current carried us home. When I returned, I found the storm already building. Men hardened bronze with hammers. Women spun bandages with steady mouths. In the distance, I felt the great shape promised me, the city to be, assembling itself like rain, a texture of earth, a smell of river mud, a murmur of forums not yet paved. If we must fight to enter that promise, then we will fight. But we will fight to build, not merely to win. So ends the passage through shadow into the first fields of home. The river turns, and with it, my story. Tomorrow the road runs from treaty to trumpet. I am Aeneas, and I have seen the shape of what must be. Now I must pay its price. The river did not lie. War ripened quickly in Latium. Trumpets woke the fields, and bronze grew hot in forges. Dust lifted from hooves before the first charge was ever sounded. I saw it in the eyes of farmers who sharpened plowshares into spearheads, in the way women sewed bandages as steadily as hymns. The land itself braced, knowing history had chosen it as an anvil. I had returned with allies. The Etruscans under Trojan, lean and iron, their ships gliding with discipline, and Pallas, Evander's son, whose youth glowed like a torch that believes itself eternal. He rode at my side, hungry for honor, and though my heart trembled at the weight of his years, I did not forbid him. Some promises bind more tightly than fear. We raised our standard, and the plain answered with Rutulian cries. Turnus, proud and swift, shone at their head. His armor caught the sun as though the day itself favored him. He was beloved by his people, strong as a storm not yet broken, and he carried himself with the certainty of one who believes the gods themselves admire his rage. He called me traitor, invader, breaker of peace. His words gathered in the ears of Latins like sparks in dry grass. The clash came sudden and merciless. Arrows thickened the air, shields rang like drums. I drove into the fray as though the sea itself had taught me to break waves. Beside me, Pallas fought, his hand sure, his courage steadier than his breath. He slew many, and the men cheered his name, Pallas, Pallas, like a new hymn. My heart swelled and broke in the same instant, for I knew destiny often loves to strike down the young first. And so it did. Turnus, eager to prove himself before both gods and men, sought the boy. They met where the ground was churned with hoofprints and blood. Pallas stood, slender yet unyielding, and spoke with the voice of his house. You will know me, Rutulian, for honor is not counted by age. He hurled his spear. It scraped Turnus's armor, but did not break him. Turnus laughed, and with a single strike drove his blade into Pallas's chest. The boy fell, his life spilling like wine upon the soil. Turnus tore from him the belt, a prize stitched with stories of slaughter, and strapped it to his own waist as though history itself were his ornament. When the news reached me, I felt the earth collapse beneath my feet. Grief sharpened into fire. I waded into battle not as a man, but as a storm. No plea softened me, no ransom cooled my blade. Those who stood between me and Turnus fell as easily as waves split by rock. Yet fate, relentless in her pacing, held him from me until the day had drained of light. That night, Evander's cries haunted me more than the clash of steel. I had promised to guard his son. Instead, I carried only his body, pale and still, wrapped for the pyre. My words of comfort were ashes in my mouth. He died with honor, I whispered to the grieving father, though honor is a poor shield for an empty chair. Evander's tears did not curse me. He was too noble for that. But they bound me tighter to the road fate demanded. Pallas's death was a debt, and I would pay it in Turnus's blood. The war widened, alliances bent and cracked. Juno herself, insatiable, tried to prolong the struggle, even smuggling Turnus away in a phantom ship when I pressed too near. Yet Jupiter, patient but firm, declared the balance must be kept. The Trojans were destined to root here, and no goddess could unwind that thread. Even Juno yielded, though with a bitterness that would last. She demanded only that the Trojans, once victorious, take the Latin name and tongue, so that the blood of Troy might dissolve into Italy rather than stand apart. Jupiter agreed, and so the shape of Rome was sealed before its stones had risen. At last the armies, weary of endless slaughter, agreed to decide it by single combat. Myself against Turnus. Dawn came pale, the sky holding its breath. The field was cleared. Both hosts stood in silence, their shields resting, their eyes locked on the two men who bore their futures. Turnus strode forward, proud as ever, his spear glittering. I stepped to meet him, feeling the weight of Troy, of Pallas, of every drowned comrade pressing my shoulders. We circled, tested, struck. His speed was a blade itself, my endurance the sea that does not yield. The ground shook beneath us as though the very earth knew it was being asked to choose. Turnus struck first, his spear grazing my shield, ringing it like a gong. I answered with a thrust that tore his thigh, slowing the storm in him. Still he fought, still he raged, his voice calling on every god who had ever smiled upon Latium. But destiny does not barter. My blade found its mark, and he fell upon the earth, sprawling like an oak split by lightning. He raised his hand, his eyes burning with the last light of pride. "I have lost," he said. "If mercy lives in you, Aeneas, spare me. My life is small, but my people look to me. For their sake." For a moment I wavered. Mercy is the sweeter crown. I saw in him not only an enemy, but a man. Proud, young, full of the same fire that had once driven Hector, Achilles, all the doomed of Troy. My hand trembled, almost lowering the blade. Then I saw it, the belt of Pallas gleaming at his waist. The story of a boy, stitched in gold, desecrated as a trophy. Grief surged again, raw as the night Troy fell. My heart hardened. "No," I whispered. "This blood pays for his." And I drove the steel into him. His breath fled, his body slackened, his eyes opened one last time to the sky he would not see again. The field was silent. Both armies watched, held by the gravity of that moment. It was not merely a duel ended, but an age begun. For with Turnus's fall, the soil of Latium accepted us, not as strangers, but as the seed of a nation that would one day call itself Rome. I stood above him, chest heaving, blade heavy, and felt the weight of destiny settle fully upon me. There was no joy, no triumph. Only the knowledge that we had paid the cost demanded. The river whispered, the hills watched, and the gods closed their book. Thus ends the wanderings of Troy, and thus begins the long labor of Rome. I, Aeneas, tell you this. A man does not choose his fate, but he may choose to bear it. And in that bearing, a people find their name. The duel was promised, yet war rarely keeps its promises. Even when kings agree, spears itch in the hands of men, and gods themselves bend treaties like reeds. Latinus, weary and wise, had sought peace. He wished to seal the bond between me and his daughter, Lavinia, so that Troy and Latium might mingle blood and grain. But Juno whispered, and anger flared. A spark leapt where none should have been. A Latin warrior hurled a spear before the oaths were finished, and in an instant the plain roared with the iron of betrayal. The pact shattered like pottery, and battle drowned the field. I fought not for conquest, but survival. Yet war has its own hunger. Every clash fed it, every cry fattened it. Men who yesterday sowed vines now sowed corpses. The dust clung to blood until the very air seemed to drink from our wounds. The gods watched. Juno, unsated, stoked Turnus with fire. Venus, ever my guardian, shielded my wounds with unseen hands. Once an arrow sang toward me, its point bright as vengeance, and would have found my heart, yet Venus bent its flight, so it grazed my helm instead. Another time, when my strength faltered, I felt a warmth settle over my limbs, and I knew she was near, pouring courage like oil on a guttering flame. But even a goddess cannot protect all. I saw noble Mezentius ride into the fray, cruel tyrant of Etruria, once hated, now forced by fate to meet me in arms. His fury was terrible. He scattered men like straw in fire. Yet when my spear struck him, he did not plead. He asked only that his body be returned to the earth, and that his son Lausus, fallen before me, be honored with the rights of the brave. His request I granted, for even in enemies I recognized the echo of fathers and sons. Turnus burned across the battlefield like a storm untethered. Wherever he went, men fell. His spear was a thunderbolt, his shield the wall of an army. 3 times we sought each other, and 3 times the tide of battle pulled us apart, as if destiny enjoyed delaying the inevitable. I could hear his voice across the field, calling me out, and I answered, though the press of warriors kept us apart. Pallas's death still weighed on me like armor soaked with water. Each foe I met seemed to carry his name on their lips. My sword remembered him more fiercely than my tongue. Yet grief is a double-edged blade. It drives the arm, but it hollows the heart. Night brought no rest. Fires marked the plain where the dead lay unburied. Each pyre rose like a column of sorrow. I walked among the bodies, hearing the silence that follows courage. Evander's face haunted me, not his living kindness, but the grief he had yet to feel when he would see his son no more. I swore again, by the ashes and by the stars, that Turnus would not escape payment. At dawn we met again. The Latins and Trojans, tired of endless slaughter, sought to parley once more. Latinus urged reason, but Amata, his queen, and many of her people raged that Lavinia should not be given to a foreigner. The girl herself stood silent, her cheeks crimson as if the gods had painted their own debate upon her face. Between duty to her father and the fury of her people, she was as trapped as I. A council was held. Drances, enemy of Turnus, accused him of pride, of dragging Latium into ruin for the sake of his own ambition. Turnus answered with fire, vowing to meet me in single combat. Yet again the agreement dissolved into fresh battle. That day the field was a book of grief. Camilla, queen of the Volscians, rode forth, fierce, swift, a huntress of war. Her spear never missed, her hair streamed like a banner. She cut through my men with the grace of a hawk among doves. Yet even she fell, pierced by a spear from the shadows. Her women wept, her people wailed. The tide of the fight swayed with her death, and I pressed forward with allies, while Turnus was drawn away by false signs sent by Juno herself. For even then the goddess sought to protect him, spiriting him far from danger, while I raged across the plain, seeking his blood. I slaughtered many, yet the duel I desired was denied me. Turnus returned only when the field was thick with corpses, his armor smeared with the dust of absence. He sought me, but again night came, merciless in its rhythm. When morning rose, the very earth seemed to beg for conclusion. Both armies, weary of the harvest of death, called again for single combat. This time Latinus agreed, though sorrow bent his shoulders. He would see one man die rather than many. The oaths were sworn, altars were set. I prayed to the sun, to the river, to every god who had watched my wandering. Turnus prayed as well, his voice defiant though shadowed with doubt. The army stood aside, their shields resting on the ground, their eyes upon us. Before the duel began, Jupiter looked down. Juno stood beside him, fierce and unbending. "Must he die?" she asked, her voice sharp with years of spite. Jupiter answered, "Destiny cannot be unmade. But I grant this. When Troy roots in Latium, they shall not bear the name of Troy. They will be Latins still. Their tongue, their dress, their gods will merge. Rome will rise not as a foreign seed, but as Italy's own flowering." At that, Juno's wrath cooled into resignation. She turned her gaze from Turnus, knowing at last that no goddess may bend the river of fate, only splash in its current. So the stage was set. The armies circled the field. Turnus and I lifted our weapons, the air between us heavy with history. For all the blood, all the wandering, all the sorrow, it would end here. Two men beneath the wide, watching sky, carrying the weight of nations on the edges of their blades. Silence fell heavier than the slain. My sword still trembled in my hand, Turnus's blood hot upon the steel. And the plain held its breath. For a moment, neither army moved. They looked not at me, nor at the fallen, but at the space between us, the space where fate had drawn its final line. Then the murmur spread, slow as dawn. The war was ended. The Rutulians, their champion gone, bowed their heads. The Trojans, scarred and weary, lifted their eyes toward a future glimpsed only in prophecy. I stood over Turnus, heart torn between mercy and grief. But the belt of Pallas glimmered once more, and with it the memory of a promise. In that act, harsh though it was, history had been sealed. The priests came forward. Oaths were renewed, this time unbroken. Altars smoked with the blood of bulls, and the sky itself seemed calmer, as though the gods were satisfied. Latinus approached, his face pale with sorrow, yet resolute. He offered me his hand, not as king to foreigner, but as father to son. Take Lavinia, he said, and with her this land. Build upon it. Let our blood mingle until no one remembers where Troy ended and Latium began. Lavinia stood silent, her gaze lowered, cheeks still marked with the crimson of omens. She did not speak, but in her stillness I felt a weight equal to my own, the burden of being more symbol than flesh. When she raised her eyes at last, I saw neither refusal nor surrender, but the steady acceptance of one who knows that her life is not her own, but her people's. In her, I recognized myself. The funeral pyres rose. Turnus was laid with honor, his warriors grieving him as I grieved Hector long ago. Camilla, Mezentius, Lausus, and the countless unnamed. They too were given to the fire. The air thickened with smoke and memory. Each flame was a pillar upon which the future rested. In those days after war, I walked the fields of Latium and felt the soil with my hands. It was dark, rich, eager to grow. I thought of the ashes it now held. Trojans and Latins mingled beneath its surface, and I knew that from such mingling strength would rise. Rome, though not yet born, already pulsed in the veins of the earth. One night, as the camp quieted and even grief slept, my father came again in dream. Anchises stood as I had last seen him in Elysium, radiant, unburdened by age. He led me once more to the river of souls, and from its silver surface faces rose, faces not yet carved by time, yet already weighted with destiny. See, my son, he said, the line you have begun. I saw kings with brows of laurel, men who would guard Rome with both sword and law. I saw Numa, priestly and gentle, binding wild strength with rights. I saw the Fabii, the Deci, the Scipios whose names would thunder across seas. And last, brighter than all, I saw a youth who bore the calm of a world in his gaze, Augustus, destined to close the gates of war and bind the earth in a golden chain of the peace. Anchises' voice flowed like the river itself. This is why you wandered, why you suffered. Troy was not the end, but the root. Rome will be the branch, wide enough to shade nations, strong enough to endure centuries. Carry this knowledge like a torch, even when night seems endless. You are not merely a man, you are a beginning. When I woke, the stars were still burning, each one a witness. My heart steadied. The burden was still there, but it had changed its weight. It no longer crushed, it guided. We began to raise walls, not grand yet, but walls nonetheless. Stakes in the ground, ditches dug, huts thatched with reeds. It was not the Troy we had lost, nor the Rome that would be. But it was a hearth, a beginning. The Lares and Penates, our household gods, were placed in a shrine facing east. When the sun rose, it gilded their little wooden faces, and I thought I saw them smile. The Latins, once our enemies, came bearing grain, oxen, timber. Slowly suspicion softened into fellowship. Children played together in the dust, not caring whether their fathers had worn Trojan crests or Rutulian helmets. Women wove together, their songs blending languages into one. Even the rivers seemed to run more gently, as though they approved of the mingling. Lavinia walked among her people with quiet dignity. Though she spoke little, each gesture carried peace. She offered sacrifices beside me. And though we were bound by fate more than affection, I felt a respect deepen, a recognition that together we bore the seed of something larger than ourselves. Yet not all wounds closed. Amata, Queen of Latins, could not forgive the cost. Her grief carried her beyond comfort, and she departed this life by her own hand before peace could soothe her. I mourned her as one mourns a necessary casualty of destiny, knowing that even the gods wept when mothers despair. Sometimes, walking the fields, I remembered the Scaean gate, the towers of Ilium, the songs we sang at festival. I remembered Hector's arm, Andromache's tears, Priam's crown, and the laughter of boys who would never grow into men. These memories came not to weaken me, but to remind me that all beginnings are paid for by endings. At night, around the fire, I told my son Ascanius of our journey. The horse, the flames, the ghost of Creusa, the storm at sea, the Queen of Carthage, the descent to the Underworld, the rage of Turnus. He listened wide-eyed, his hand resting on the hilt of the small sword I had given him. One day, I said, you will build walls more lasting than these. You will be called Iulus, and from your line great houses will descend. Remember always, strength without duty is ruin. Carry both. He nodded, and in his gaze I saw Rome's dawn. Do not think I lived without sorrow. Dido's face still visited me in dreams, her eyes blazing, her voice a curse. Pallas's laughter haunted me, echoing in moments of quiet. Each name lost was a stone in my chest. But grief, carried long enough, becomes part of the road. You walk not despite it, but with it. And together you arrive where you must. Sometimes I wondered whether mercy might have been better, whether sparing Turnus would have mended wounds more swiftly. But then I touched the belt of Pallas, preserved in the shrine, and I knew. Destiny does not bargain with mercy. Rome required blood to take root, and it was mine to spill. Years later, when the first stones of Alba Longa rose and the fields rang with harvest, I climbed a hill and looked west. The sun sank into the sea, gilding the horizon with fire. And in that fire I saw it, not with eyes, but with heart, the city to come. Marble arches, forums humming with voices, legions marching beneath standards kissed by eagles. I saw bridges spanning the Tiber, aqueducts carrying water like veins, theaters echoing with poetry, temples crowned with smoke. I saw wars, yes, but also peace. I saw law carved into tablets, wisdom debated in halls, children laughing on roads paved for centuries. I saw emperors both noble and flawed, victories that would stretch Rome's name to the edges of the known world. I saw betrayal, too, and cruelty, for no empire is free of shadow. But through it all, I saw endurance, the steady pulse of a city that refused to die. And in that vision, I understood. I was not merely founding a home for the scattered survivors of Troy. I was planting the heart of history. So hear me, you who listen in the quiet hours. I am Aeneas, son of Anchises, son of Venus, exile of Troy, father of Rome. My road was carved by flame and wave, by grief and promise. I lost a city to find an empire. I left love to gain duty. I carried my father on my back, my son at my side, and the gods in my arms. If you walk in Rome one day, if you stand beneath arches that catch the sun or sit in forums where voices rise like birds, remember that it began here, in the ashes of a fallen city, in the tears of a widowed queen, in the blood of a youth named Pallas, in the mercy denied to Turnus, and in the steadfastness of one man who could not choose his fate but chose to bear it. Rome is not mine alone. It belongs to all who endure, who wander yet do not yield, who suffer yet still build. This is the gift of Troy, carried through me to you. And now my voice grows quiet, as voices must. The river runs on, the fields of Latium green with promise, the lairs smiling from their shrine. My son will walk further than I, his sons further still, until the world itself bends to the name of Rome. I am Aeneas, and I have spoken. We began in ash and ended in omen. Between the two lay work, the honest labor of hands, the quiet stubbornness of seed, the little songs that mothers hum when evening finds the door. After the fires of war had cooled and the treaty smoke thinned into ordinary weather, we staked out a town on the shore the sea kept licking as if to bless it. We called it Lavinium, for the woman whose silence steadied a people the way a keel steadies a ship. Our first walls were only a suggestion of walls, ditches, palisades, a gate that was a promise more than a barrier. Still, when the gate swung at dawn and groaned at dusk, there was a music in it that sounded like tomorrow. We set the lyres and penates, our little household gods, facing east so the first light might touch their brows. We gave them honey and oil and the smoke of time, and the smoke remembered the old city while learning the name of the new. Men shouldered timber up from the river. Boys ran in packs, inventing rules they would someday call laws. Women ground grain until the stones themselves seemed to purr with plenty. And when the first bread rose, I thought, this is heavier than prophecy. This is what destiny actually weighs. Lavinia walked the streets with a basket on her arm, as if queenship were an herb to be gathered. She did not spend words to make herself understood. When she paused by a work gang and held the rim of a water pail while a man drank, the whole crew straightened as though a standard had passed. When we offered at the altars, she touched the knife with a sure hand, and the smoke rose straighter. She was not the reason fate had chosen us, but she was the reason we fit inside fate, as if it had been tailored. Years braided themselves without asking our leave. Our son grew. In Troy we called him Ascanius. In Latium, men began to say Iulus, for the way the syllables curled like a young vine around an old column. I trained him with a gentleness I had not learned in time for myself. How to sit a horse so the horse believed in him. How to string a bow without making the wood afraid. How to keep his anger in its sheath longer than his sword. At night, I told him the parts of our story that were not merely pain. The sea that glittered with impossible stars, the kindness of strangers, the way even a ruined city can teach you to love brick, Lavinium fattened on harvests and births. But destiny, which never stops walking even when you do, kept its schedule. One morning, the household gods flickered on their shelf, the way a candle trembles just before a door opens. I dreamed my father stood by a curve in a river and tapped the water with his staff, counting invisible footsteps. When I woke, I knew. Iulus would need a city of his own, inland, where hills lean together and hold a secret between them. So we gave him men, wagons, the good mules that forgive more than they remember. And he went north, following the old path of prophecy where the oaks keep counsel with the wind, where the ridge opens like a smile and the morning air smells of mint. He founded Alba Longa, the long white spine along the hills, a necklace of hearths that caught the light and threw it from door to door. There he learned the second art of kingship, not only to strike, but to wait. Under him the line lengthened, sons whose names even I could not hold, though their faces came to me sometimes in dreams like coins I had touched once and lost in the grass. Kings woke, ruled, slept. The years made their round sound on the anvil of the mountain. The law learned to wear a toga. The plow learned to walk straighter than the spear. But prophecy is a river that keeps a list. One night, a Vestal's dream broke into daylight. In Alba Longa lived Rhea Silvia, priestess sworn to the cool chastity of the moon. The god of redder business, Mars himself, iron-muscled and young with ancient rage, looked on her and loved her with that divine economy that never spends a second doubt. From that union came the cry of twins. A king fearful for his seat ordered the little bodies thrown to the river like unwanted letters. But the Tiber remembers, and always will. He tucked the boys into a soft eddy, guided their basket to the root work beneath a fig, and called the forest to midwife. A she-wolf came, all ribs and milk, eyes yellow as late straw. She lowered herself and gave them what gods and men had refused to name. Life as a warm tongue of milk, breath that counted for two. A woodpecker drummed a blessing. A shepherd found the three together, a beast, two infants, a god's joke warming itself in the morning, and brought the boys home to a hearth that didn't ask for pedigrees. They grew tall on hill wind and rumor. Romulus and Remus, names that sound like the two halves of the same hinge. Fists learned, feet learned, the eye that measures a wall learned what height means and what it's for. Quarrels are the price brotherhood pays for force. The boys argued not about whether to build a city, but about where to drop the first shadow of a wall. Birds were asked to judge. The sky shrugged two different answers. Blood fell. A brother lay. Grief made its hard law. The earth will take one to make room for many. Rome rose on the Palatine, not all at once, not marble, not even sure of its verbs. A plowed furrow for a boundary, a ditch, a line of spears that would one day call themselves columns. A handful of households stubborn enough to stand back up when wind pushed twice. Men came with nothing but their backs and their vices. Women came later, their shoulders carrying more future than anyone at the time could count. My mother once told me love and theft share a border stone. Rome took wives, it is useless to gild it, but then kept them like breath. Those women remade the city with patience sharper than steel. Where men shouted, women arranged. Where men bled, women bound. Where men swore, women remembered. And that is the stronger oath. Kings sat on seats that would become metaphors. Numa taught the calendar to walk in sandals, not boots. He braided rights into days, so anger would break its stride to listen. Tullus woke war again, because peace gets lazy and sometimes needs a hard teacher. Anchises loved the river and made it love him back with bridges. Strange men with brighter sandals came, the Tarquins. And Rome learned that splendor often carries a knife under the cloak. Pride burned in a palace until a woman's wound called the city to itself. Brutus, eyes longer than his patience, lifted the word liberty like a door off its hinges. The kings went out. The republic came in. 2 consuls handcuffed to one another by law so that power would not gallop alone. The people, who had carried stones and water and children for decades, finally heard their back-named tribune and found the spine that goes with such a word. I tell you this not as a historian. Histories grow like ivy, covering whatever truth they can. But as a father of a beginning, I felt these names before they were spoken. They were the pressure in my chest when I lifted my father from the burning house, the ache in my arm when I did not spare Turnus. Destiny was not the lightning. It was the ground that chose where lightning would prefer to strike. Wars came as plainly as harvest. To the south, across the same sea that had salted our grief, a city rose on cunning and purple dye. Carthage, whose queen had loved me and cursed me. The curse grew hooves. It learned shipwright's math and the language of elephants. Generals with faces like carved olives brought thunder across mountains that did not know it had a word. Hannibal knocked on Roman gates with a calm knuckle. Rome did not answer with screaming. Rome answered with time. With Fabius, who learned to win by not losing. With Scipio, who burned bright as if wearing the very noon for armor. The sea decided in a vocabulary of oars. The shore wrote the answer in smoke. Carthage's walls learned what Troy's had learned. Dido's curse softened into history, which is the only mercy empires receive. Inside, Rome argued with itself the way trees argue with wind, noisy, necessary. Brothers named Gracchus tried to redistribute the shape of hunger. One was cut down in daylight, the other bled on a hill. Wheat and law reconsidered their vows. Sulla marched on his own city to teach it fear. The city remembered only how to survive. A man with laughter like a brass bowl, Cicero, made sentences that could out-talk swords, though not forever. Caesar crossed a river whose name will always mean decision. When he fell, people learned again that even bright knives make dark rooms. Another man, cold as the polished inside of a shell, Octavian, studied patience until patience said, "Sir." He and Antony measured the hap against their appetite. A woman in Egypt measured both men and found them mortal. You do not need me to list it all. You know how it ends in that first ending. The gates of Janus closed, the chains of war slack for once. A pax that was not a sleep, but a steadiness, like a hand laid on a restless shoulder until the shoulder remembers itself. Augustus. I knew him before he had a name, in that scene by the river of souls when my father pointed and the air brightened as if anticipating a harvest. He was not a god, though people practiced saying it. He was a gardener with armies, making straight beds from which marble could grow. But Rome is not its emperors. Rome is a sound. It is sandals on the via, a woman bargaining for figs, boys throwing knuckle bones where someday law will be recited, a mason licking his thumb to smooth a seam that no one will look at, but many will touch. It is a soldier riding home with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. I am alive. The rain here is different. I saw a bird today that looked like a joke the gods would tell. It is a mither waking before dawn to warm water and promise. It is a slave buying freedom one coin at a time and then tucking the papers not into his tunic but into his chest like a second heart. If you ask me whether I am proud, I will tell you the truth. Pride is a rope. It can pull or strangle. I walk the line like a man carrying water in a shallow bowl. I am proud of the mornings when the smoke from altars rises straight. I am proud when men lay aside their blades to lift a lintel. I am proud when my son looks at a quarrel and finds the place in it that can be folded instead of cut. Creusa visits sometimes in dreams, not to accuse, not to forgive, but to remind. She stands at the edge of a field I do not recognize. Broad, clean, its furrows running like lines of verse, and says only, "Build the days." I wake and find that the advice is lighter than the sword and heavier than the crown, which is why it is perfect. Once a year, on the night Troy fell, I take the little gods down from their shelf and set them on the floor so their wooden feet can remember what floors feel like. I open the door and let the wind in, though it smells now of river mud and not of cedar smoke. I kneel and thank the fire for choosing me gently when it could have done worse. I name Pallas aloud. I name Dido aloud. I name Turnus aloud. I do not argue with those names anymore. I let them stand like stones that mark a road. And when dawn unseals the world, I lift the layers back to their place. They fit into their outlines. So do I. A traveler came once from far north, his cloak scuffed with continents, and he asked me what Rome would be like when it had finished being young. I told him cities do not finish. They molt. They forget and remember. They burn and relay brick. They mistake noise for greatness and then find greatness in quiet. They learn the cost of statues, which is not money. They never stop balancing the ledger between justice and mercy, knowing the numbers will never settle but must be kept anyway. He nodded like a man who had seen tide charts. He left with a loaf under his arm and a story longer than the road. If you stand one evening on the Capitoline while the light is busy making everything forgive everything, and you put your hand on the warm stone of a wall, you will feel it. The low, steady hum that is not the city's noise, but its intention. That is what we brought across the sea in our arms when our hands were too full to carry anything else. Not the exact shape of a gate, not the names of streets, not a king, never a king. We brought an agreement with endurance. We brought the willingness to be repaired. I am asked, sometimes by boys with helmets too large for the heads inside them, whether I regret. Regret is a garden tool. You can weed with it, or you can dig holes. I use it sparingly. I regret that a belt glinted when a plea was made. I regret that a queen's last word caught fire and flew for centuries. I regret that sons teach fathers to die by doing it first. But I do not regret leaving the city that left me. A man who does not walk cannot arrive. A people who refuse the boat cannot have a harbor. So take this, you who listen with your head against a window, the glass shivering with some train's opinion. If your own walls fall, if the map folds you into a corner you did not expect, lift what you can. Your elders, your children, your little rough gods that smell of oil and bread. Walk until the river meets you halfway. Where a sow sleeps under oaks, call it a sign. Where a stranger gives you water, call it a treaty. Where you must choose between mercy and memory, Choose carefully, and then carry the choice without looking behind too often. Build the days. That is all there is that lasts. When I am dust, when even my name has been sanded smooth by the tongues of schoolboys reciting it, I hope the city is still making its humble thunder. Markets, forums, the long talk of law, the soft talk of love. I hope a mason still licks his thumb. I hope mothers still hum. I hope someone in armor pauses on a bridge and decides to go home early because the light is too beautiful to miss. If those things are true, then all of this, the ash, the sea, the sword raised and lowered, will have been worth the shoulder it required. I am Aeneas. I carry less now than I once did, and more. I stand in a doorway that is also a century. I listen to the river's braid and hear in it the names of sons not yet born and cities not yet tried. If you meet me, I will not look like a statue. I will look like a man who has learned to set down what cannot be carried and to carry what cannot be set down. Rome hums behind me like a hive thinking honey. The lairs watch from their shelf, their small mouths happy with smoke. The sky above Latium shakes out its blue like a fresh cloth. And the day, which is always new no matter how old it grows, asks me for the same thing it asked on the morning after Troy: to begin. The work of beginnings is never finished. Each day demanded something simple: a trench cleared, a child fed, a quarrel judged. And yet within those small acts, I heard the thrum of a greater loom, weaving Rome's cloak one humble thread at a time. I walked often through the half-built streets of Lavinium. The houses leaned like tired men, but stood. Smoke rose from hearths, carrying with it the smell of lentils, garlic, and bread. To those who had known only hunger and ash, even that smell was a hymn. At the market, women bargained over olives, the rhythm of their voices steadier than drums. Boys chased dogs until both were too exhausted to continue, and I thought, these are the seeds of empire, not marble or gold, but laughter. When I visited Alba Longa, Iulus showed me the long ridge where houses clustered like beads on a string. His face had changed, more angles, more shadow, but his voice still carried the eager rise of youth. "Father," he said, "I see further now. This hill is not enough. One day there will be more hills, more walls. Our blood will travel like fire carried from torch to torch." I placed my hand on his shoulder and told him, "Carry the fire carefully. Flames can build or destroy, but only patience can make them last." The line stretched onward like a path the gods themselves walked. Silvius, son of Iulus, ruled after him, his eyes gray as dawn. Then others followed, their names written in bark, in clay, in the songs of shepherds. The forest remembered them even when men forgot. Some were just, their judgments echoing for years. Some were cruel, their memory buried in shallow graves. Yet all carried the thread, whether in glory or shame, because destiny does not discard even flawed hands. I saw them in dreams. Numitor, gentle as a brook, and Amulius, whose greed cut that brook into silence. And then the twins, Romulus and Remus, suckled by a beast more merciful than kings. When Romulus struck his brother and raised the first wall, I felt the earth itself shudder. A city founded in blood will never forget it, carries blood in its roots. Yet from that act rose Rome, and Rome would learn to use even sorrow as mortar. From my vantage, I saw centuries unroll like a scroll. The Republic lifted itself, awkward but determined. 2 men yoked each year so power would not gallop alone. Citizens gathered in the forum, their shouts like surf, their votes pebbles that could bruise a king. The Senate, grave in their white togas, argued as if words were spears, sometimes sharper. Then legions, rivers of men with shields flashing like scales, roads spread, straight as judgment, binding fields to cities, cities to coasts, coasts to the edge of the known world. Aqueducts walked like giants across valleys, carrying the gift of water. Arches climbed into the sky, daring time itself to knock them down. I smelled victory smoke in Carthage, Corinth, Jerusalem. I heard the creak of ships bearing grain from Egypt, amber from the north, silk from lands even the gods whispered about. And through it all, Rome's name grew heavier until it was not merely a city, but a weather that covered the world. Do not think the gods vanished. Jupiter watched from his high seat, stern but satisfied. Venus softened storms when she could, her hand still mothering. Mars walked boldly in every camp, eager for his son's noise. And Juno, though her wrath once hunted me, came at last to tolerate what could not be undone. She sat like a weary queen, her eyes still sharp but her hands folded, accepting that Rome would live. Though it was born of the seed she despised. Even gods learn resignation when centuries prove them wrong. Yet empire is not only legions and marble. I saw bakers rising before dawn, their hands white with flour, their breath clouding in cold courtyards. I saw midwives carrying bowls of hot water through narrow alleys, their sandals slapping like urgent prayers. I saw children practicing letters scratched on wax tablets, the alphabet crawling uncertainly like ants, but already spelling out futures. I saw lovers by the Tiber, whispering beneath fig trees, their promises as fragile and eternal as starlight. I saw slaves buying freedom coin by coin, and freedmen building shops where once they had carried another man's burdens. I saw the funerals of the poor, small processions with cracked flutes. Yet even there the lairs were honored, and the pyres sent their smoke as bravely as any king's. Rome's greatness was not marble. It was repetition. Every dawn, every sacrifice, every vow kept or broken, layering itself until centuries stood as solid as walls. If I am asked what Rome is, I will not point to arches or armies. I will say it is the willingness to begin again. Troy burned, but from Troy's ash we built Lavinium. Lavinium gave Alba Longa. Alba Longa gave Rome. And Rome will give the world a rhythm it will never forget. When my time ended, I did not fall with a sword in my hand. I walked into the river mists one dawn, and the Lares did not weep. They only straightened, as if to salute. Some say I vanished, lifted by the gods. Others say I drowned. But I know the truth. I became part of the thread, woven into Rome's endless cloth. So you who listen centuries later, remember this. Every stone has ash beneath it. Every law has grief behind it. Every piece has a sword buried in its roots. Yet from such burdens, greatness is carved. I am Aeneas, and though I began as an exile, I end as a father. My children are not only flesh of my flesh, but every voice that calls itself Roman. And Rome, still humming, still breathing, still stubborn, remains the proof that destiny, though cruel, can also be merciful. And so ends the journey of Aeneas, the exile of Troy, the father of Rome, from fire and wandering to vision and destiny. His footsteps became the foundation of an empire that would endure for centuries. I hope this story has brought you calm and wonder tonight. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what other legends or histories would you like to hear next? If you enjoyed this journey, please remember to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale. Until we meet again, may your night be peaceful, your dreams rich, and your heart steady. Good night.